Hello, welcome to Mystery in Middle Grade. My name is Anne, and this is my very first BookTube video. Although I have been posting under the name Mystery in Middle Grade on Substack for a little while now. I'm excited to share this new chapter with you all and introduce myself to you. I primarily read children's books, mostly in the middle grade area, but I also read adult mysteries and I throw in some romance and some classics and sometimes some contemporary fiction as well. So let's turn the page and get started with this episode. For this first video, I thought it would be fun to introduce myself through the books that I have enjoyed throughout the years of my life. I'm going to start with my childhood and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself as I talk about some of the books that I have enjoyed. So, as a child, I was a very early reader. I could read before kindergarten, and after that, I was a voracious reader. I started reading chapter books very early, and some of my very first chapter books that I enjoyed were the Little House on the Prairie series, which I'm sure I don't have to introduce to you all. I will mention sometimes today adults don't choose this for the children in their lives because of the comments in the books about the negative comments about Native Americans. However, when I'm reading to a child, I prefer to continue with the story and just use those time sensitive things that wouldn't be done today as a moment of discussion. So I would still recommend the Little House series for people who are interested in historical fiction and because lore does grow over time. And the very first book, which is Little House in the Big Woods and then Little House on the Prairie, show her at a very young age. And so those are particularly fun to read with younger kids or for them to read on their own as some of their first chapter books. One of the other series that I particularly loved was the Betsy Tacy series. And then it does go on to be Betsy Tacy Tib when they meet a third friend named Tib. These series, Betsy starts out as a 5 year old and she grows throughout the series and she's a young adult in the last ones. That's one of the reasons I love this series. I read it many, many times as I was a kid because I loved just seeing her grow through the years. I also loved mysteries even at a young age when my first couple years of chapter book reading. And I would read things like the Bobbsey twins, which are a very old fashioned mystery. There were two sets of twins, actually, younger twins and older twins, and they would solve cozy little mysteries. So they are kind of classic and maybe not read so much anymore, but they were part of my childhood for sure. This is one of my, you can see, very well loved classic books that was passed down to me from older generations, like my mom, my grandmother, maybe. Then another one you all will recognize, Nancy Drew. She is classic. I have these yellow hardbound ones. We also had the Hardy Boys versions in my household for my brother, but I read all of them multiple times. I loved them. Now, today's readers might find Nancy to be a little bit kind of prim and proper. She's always wearing skirts on her adventure and smoothing them down. And, he's talking about having very good manners and so on. And some of the writing could be a little stilted for today's readers. They have come out with some new versions of Nancy Drew for different levels of readers, like the Nancy Drew Diaries. This is the first one, Curse of the Arctic Star. And I do recommend these if I am talking to somebody about the Nancy Drew series. I do recommend these Nancy Drew Diaries because the characters are more updated. The writing is if anything, a little bit better than these old yellowback ones. So I would encourage people to check out the new Nancy Drews if you want to try Nancy Drew. Although traditionalists can't go wrong either with going with the old ones. I did read things like, oh, Trixie Belden. She was another mystery amateur child sleuth. And I loved the Trixie Belle series. There were many in this series, but I started to feel like she was a static character. She never changed. She was always the same age. Everything was the same. She lived in the same house. She never changed. And I started to feel like I wanted my characters to grow, like the Betsy Tacy characters. So Trixie Belden, I really, really loved as she's part of my early love of mysteries. But I did find in the early reading of series that I like characters that change and grow throughout their series. As I became a little bit more mature reader, I was still really young, but I would read classics like The Wind in the Willows. Some people I know aren't as fond of this one because there's a couple of things in there that seem too old fashioned for today's readers, but I still love these cranky characters and the adventures they go on. You can see that my book has once again been well loved. So I still would recommend people who aren't afraid to tackle some of the old fashioned language and themes to try out The Wind in the Willows even today. Also, I read books like A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I just love the idea of this little orphan girl and how she makes her way in the world. And when she's sent to this boarding school and has to kind of fend for herself. And other books by Frances Hodgson Burnett, Secret Garden, Little Lord Fauntleroy. I read and loved all of these at that age. I was not afraid to tackle that old fashioned language, including in this book, shows you almost nothing from the cover about who it is, except there's a series of ladies on the cover because it's Little Women. This is a very, very old version. You can see that it has been well read over the years. So this was passed down to me from my older relatives, and I read it many times growing up. And the Little Women is part of a series. So I also read all the other Little Women series. So I liked, again, to see these characters that I get to know and love, and then over time get to see them grow and learn more about themselves over time. Also, during this time, I discovered A Wrinkle in Time, which I'm sure so many of you are familiar with. And the movie that came out a number of years ago has probably brought in a new audience for this. We still did have people ask for this at the library, but this also has more in the series. I was such an avid reader that when I would go to the library, I could find my own stack of books and I rarely asked a librarian for help. And so I distinctly remember in fifth grade when a boy in my class noticed I was reading this, and he talked about how much he loved this series and the sequels. And I could not believe it. There are sequels to this book. And so, in about fifth grade, I started reading all the other Madeleine L'Engle books and fell in love with them again. And later on, when I was even in high school and college, I would read these. Madeleine L'Engle was my favorite author for a very long time. One of the things I liked about her and her other series is that she does tie-ins between the two series that she has, and she also you see the characters grow over time, which I really like that, as you can tell. I also read our favorite series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, many, many times when I was growing up. Now, I didn't get to the library as often as I needed to keep me in stock with books that were new to me. And so I would read and reread and reread the books that we owned in our house, some of those that I've already mentioned. And then I owned the set of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia. And I read and read and reread them so many times that they fell apart and I got another set as an adult. But these are beloved for me as they are for many of you. So I know I don't even need to tell you what they're about because you already know. So during this time in later elementaries, I also still liked mystery series. Now, Harriet the Spy is not exactly a mystery as such, but Harriet was definitely like an amateur sleuth. She lived in an apartment building and she decided she was going to spy on her neighbors. And that gets her into some scrapes and troubles, as you can imagine. But this book was written first in 1969, I believe. And I loved it as a child, an elementary school reader. And people do still read this one today. When I was in high school, I read the classics because that's what we read during English class. And when I wasn't reading for English class, I was going back to some of my old childhood favorites and still reading those over and over. When I was ready to move out of those children's books and find other things for myself that weren't the classics, I wasn't sure what to do because back then we didn't have a teen section of our library. We didn't have a young adult area. And so I wasn't sure, what do I do now that I'm ready to jump up into the adult section of the library? And my father suggested that I try Agatha Christie. So here's one of Agatha Christie's famous books, Death on the Nile. And I read many Agatha Christie books, and then I read Ellery Queen and other classic mystery authors when I was in middle school and high school. I loved it. So I went back again to my love of mysteries during that time of my life. I did still keep my love of fantasy and middle grade. And so when I was an English major in college, when I was ready to go on to graduate school, I found a program at Simmons College, which is now called Simmons University, that allowed me to get a master's degree in children's literature. And I was so excited about that because even in college, I had sought out those classes in the education department that studied children's literature because I really, even though I was in my 20s, I wasn't ready to put those books behind. They still meant so much to me, and they still were that cozy, comforting reading that my heart desired. And so I really wanted to do more of it. So I went to this master's degree program, absolutely loved it. I fell in love with high fantasy once again. I always loved it as a child, but I loved it even more as I was older and could see the themes of the light and the dark and the good versus evil. And I just found that to speak to me in a way that contemporary fiction didn't always do. So, some of the ones that I wanted to mention, particularly that I found during those kind of early young adult years, was the Wizard of Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this actually is about a wizard named Ged. He grows again during over the course of this series, but I just love this series, and it does also bring in some other characters. So some of the books are not all completely about him. Another series that I loved is the Lloyd Alexander series. Now, this is the first one, the Book of Three, which many people may not be quite as familiar with as The Black Cauldron. The Black Cauldron was made into a Disney movie, which unfortunately I can't recommend. It really wasn't that well done, but Lloyd Alexander was one of my favorite authors during this time of my life. I had an opportunity to meet him when I graduated from my master's degree program. My first job was at the Hornbook magazine. Now, the Hornbook, if you don't know about it, you should if you're a person who loves children's books because they do reviews of all the new children's books that come out. And they also, in the magazine, include articles by experts and interviews with authors and so on. And once a year, they have the Boston Globe Hornbook Awards. And one of the years that I worked at the Hornbook, Lloyd Alexander was a winner, and he was there at the awards. And staff got to escort some of the authors around in between events. And my boss at the time knew that I loved Lloyd Alexander and let me be his escort. So that is a very fun memory for me. He was a delightful person. He was not much taller than I was, and he was just so friendly and fun to talk to, one of my very favorite authors. So, for that reason, if no others, The Chronicles of Prydain is one of my favorite memories of books that I loved during that stage. After I stopped working at the Hornbook, I moved back to my hometown and eventually started working at a bookstore. And I managed a bookstore. While I was there, I continued to read the children's books that I loved so much, but I did read more mysteries. And I found the Elizabeth Peters mystery series. She has a fun, fun character named Amelia Peabody. There are 23 of in this series. This is the first one, and Amelia starts out in this one as a single lady, and she's going to go out and explore the world. So she goes to Egypt, and she meets an Egyptologist there who really gets on her nerves, but also she's kind of interested in him. And so then in the remainder of the series, they become a couple, and it continues to go on through the adventures of their married lives. So this is the start of it all. I can't recommend it enough. It has a lot of humor in this series, but they do tackle mysteries. So for mystery lovers who are looking for some fun, a little romance, some humor, and some craziness that really wouldn't necessarily think is believable, it's still lots of fun. So Elizabeth Peters was one of the authors that I learned to love early in my time doing mysteries. So then I worked at the bookstore for a while, and then I became a young adult assistant at a library system. And so my reading switched once again, and I started to read mostly teen and young adult books published during that time because I wanted to be able to interact with the customers I was serving and because I loved the books. And so, just an example, Looking for Alaska by John Green was one of the books that I particularly remember. I was part of a book group at that time, and we just read whatever young adult books we wanted to, and we came together and discussed them. And I remember bringing this book to the group and telling them how much it affected me. The main character is a boy at a boarding school, and partway through the book, a tragedy happens. And the book follows through with that emotional arc of the story, and we see the character growing and learning from this experience. And it just really brought that teenage experience to life. Now, this book did win the Prince Prize. It's one of the early winners of the Prince Prize, and John Green has gone on to do a lot of other books. The Fault in My Stars, which became a movie, is one of his more popular ones. And he does have a new book that's just come out for adults called Everything is Tuberculosis, which I also read. And so he's really expanded what he's doing. He's still actively writing today. I really enjoy his writing. I will say some of his books have appeared on banned books lists because of some of the content. He really attempts to remain very concerned with representing teenagers as they truly are and not just as stereotypes of who we would like teenagers to be. So the teenagers do get into some issues which some parents don't want their kids to read about. And so they have landed on some banned books lists, but I am still a proponent of his writing. So I worked as a teen in the teen department of the library for a number of years, and then I became a mom, got married first, became a mom, and spent a number of years at home with my kids. During that time, as you can imagine, we read lots and lots of board books and picture books, and we did a lot of reading in our house. When they were a little older, we read chapter books out loud to them, and during those years, when I had time to read for myself, I just wanted something different from children's books. And so I went back to my love of mystery. I got into other series. I loved Michael Connelly, C.J. Box, Tessa Gerritsen, Lisa Gardner, Tammy Ho, and many other series mystery authors. I would go to the library. I would scan the shelves for mystery books that had a whole bunch of them. So I knew that if I found one book by the author that I liked, I could continue on and on and on and continue reading those books in that series with those characters. And even now today, I still will pick up those same authors when they have a new book come out because again, I just love to see those characters grow through time. I like to go back and revisit the characters I've known in the past, and that just is comforting for me. I love the police detective series. I love amateur sleuths. I just love all kinds of adult mysteries. So that remains one of my favorite series to read. when I returned to employment a number of years ago, I started out working at a bookstore again, this time at a Barnes and Noble. And I wanted to expand my reading beyond mysteries so that I could help any customer who came into the store. I spent a lot of time in the children's department at that store because of my knowledge and understanding of love of children's books, but I also did general readers advisory for anybody who came in the store. And so that's when I started to expand my reading, and I read some romance books and discovered, boy, romance has really changed since I would sneak my mom's romance books off of her shelf and read them when I was a child. I also have started to read some of the contemporary fiction that would be on the bestseller list that customers would ask for. So, those things, as you follow my YouTube, you'll see those other adult books that are not mysteries popping into my reading lists pretty often. So after the bookstore, I went back to working at a library and worked in the children's department of my local public library. And so I have been going back then to reading a lot of children's books so that I could help all the kids who were there looking for books to read and asking me to recommend them something that they would really like. And so some of the recent things that I have particularly loved include Impossible Creatures by Catherine Rundell. Now, many of you may have heard of this series already because this was the first book in the series, and this past year in 2025, she did come out with a sequel. There will be more in this series as well. So I can't recommend the series enough. The main point is that there's a boy who discovers his way into a world where creatures like dragons and sphinxes still exist. They've lived in this other kind of dimension. And so he goes there and adventures happen to him. I'm not going to reveal what he goes through, but I'll tell you, this book is heartrending. The second book is not as heartrending as this one. It brings in some additional characters as well. So I love Impossible Creatures. Another one that I particularly loved recently is Bad Badger. Now, this cover is kind of grayish, but I think you can see it. Bad Badger is an anthropomorphic animal, so he acts like a person, but he is a badger and he lives in this sweet little house and he loves to listen to his records and drink tea, and he just wishes he had a friend. So he makes a friend with the bird on his windowsill, and the bird doesn't talk except in bird talk, so he names the bird Gully, and he sets out to befriend this bird and show this bird some of the things in his life. And it goes from there. Some things go well, some things go not so well, but their friendship is delightful. And this is just such a fun, sweet book to read. It reminded me of the Frog and Toad series, which I also have always loved. So, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love you to subscribe to receive my upcoming content. And please leave comments below about favorite books from your past if you would like to discuss that. I love talking books, and we'll see you next time.